Welcome back. In this lecture, I want to turn from the thinking of philosophers and theologians and the poetry and prose of writers to consider several disturbing experiments that psychologists have performed in recent decades that suggest a set of disquieting insights about human nature and its susceptibility to what we want to call evil. Can evil be understood? Can it be studied in a scientific manner? In the way that we study plants or rats or neutrons or atoms? People have tried to do this for some time. But since World War II, this pressure has become greater because of worries that many have. We saw this most prominently formulated by the thinker Hannah Arendt, that the evils of the 20th century are in some sense unprecedented and need new thinking, not just the repetition of old traditional ways of thinking, but genuinely new thinking to figure out what evil is in its essence and what to do about its challenge. And so, since World War II, and in some ways prompted by the events of World War II, a number of social scientists, and especially social psychologists, have begun to develop experiments that are sometimes of questionable moral status themselves. We'll hear about that in a minute. But experiments that attempt to get at measuring the human's tendencies towards blind obedience or willful engagement, sometimes, in inflicting cruelty and suffering on other humans. Just as an interesting side note, it's worth noting that there have actually been significantly fewer studies from the opposite side, from the side of victims, what it is like to be a victim in these situations. Why that is, I won't speculate here. Now, I have some very good friends in the social sciences who are involved in this work. I think that sometimes they're a bit too confident about their findings, both in terms of the lessons that they take away from them and the novelty that they ascribe to those lessons. But nonetheless, these studies, these experiments are really quite revealing and not as well known as I think they should be. Most generally, these studies suggest that, in a way that few philosophers and theologians have seemed fully to appreciate, who you are and how you behave is significantly dependent on where you are, on your context, on your setting. People's character is, in other words, interestingly and significantly context-specific. If you're in a setting where conditions are conducive to being a good person, you're more likely to be a good person. If you are in a setting where that is not the case, the opposite outcome can be anticipated. As I said, these are interesting and thought-provoking experiments, and I suspect we'll have more of them in coming years. One of the most burgeoning fields in psychology right now is a field called positive psychology. That is a study of not so much how humans go wrong, as psychology has traditionally been in the 20th century anyway, a study of human pathologies. Positive psychology wants to study what are the conditions that make humans go right. Now, whether on the negative or the positive side, these psychological studies will actually answer conclusively any of the questions we've been asking, and the questions we actually want answers to about evil, wickedness, cruelty, is another question. But nonetheless, I think these are very interesting and important studies. In this lecture, I want to look at 3 experiments in particular, each of which has troubled those who engaged in them and those who reflect on them in important and profound ways. In wide-ranging discussions of thinking about evil, these experiments come up again and again. And so it's worth your while to hear about them and to consider their implications. They are the famous Milgram experiments on obedience to authority, Philip Zimbardo's notorious Stanford prison experiment, quote unquote, and the disturbing series of Good Samaritan studies run at Princeton Theological Seminary. First, consider the famous Milgram experiment. Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University, began in 1961 a series of experiments that were prompted by his reflections on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the same trial that Arendt reported on. His question was, were those who perpetrated the Holocaust individually motivated to do so, or were they really, as many of them said, just following orders? I don't want to confuse the arguments of Arendt and Milgram here, so don't think that they're saying the same thing. consider each of these arguments separately. Here, let's just focus on Milgram. The experiment he designed was designed to highlight the power of authority for humans by showing the power that concrete authorities could have over ordinary people. People were recruited in these studies unknowingly for the experiment in which they were ordered by an experimenter dressed as a scientist in a white coat to inflict a series of electric shocks of escalating and finally, clearly deadly voltage upon a victim, strapped to a chair in another room, out of sight, but not, unfortunately for the subjects, not out of hearing. As the subjects thought they were giving the victims increasingly more powerful shocks, a tape recorder in the other room played a series of increasingly desperate cries, while an actor banged on a wall, then fell ominously silent as the shock levels rose above a certain level. Throughout the screams, some subjects exhibited clear signs of dissonance, what psychologists call dissonance, nervous laughter, sweating, shaking, but reliably, when asked, they would continue, and they would escalate the pain. At the point where the victim stopped making any noise, many subjects asked to stop and see if the victim was okay. But the scientist induced them to keep going with a series of 4 increasingly stern commands to continue, culminating in the final verbal command. If they kept saying, we should check on this person, the final thing they would say is, you have no other choice, you must go on. If they still wanted to stop after the 4th command, the experiment would stop. Otherwise, they continued giving these shocks until they had given 3 450-volt shocks in succession to the now silent victim, at which point the experiment was considered complete. In Milgram's first set of experiments, fully 65% of the participants delivered these experiments' final series of shocks, though many were very uncomfortable doing so. Now remember, this is an experiment. There are no real people being shocked here. No one is actually being hurt. There's a tape recorder. There are actors banging on the walls. This is all fabricated by Milgram, though the subjects don't know it's being fabricated. At some point, every participant in the experiment, every subject, paused and questioned the experiment. Some said they would refund the money, they'd give it back, they were paid for participating in the experiment. Interestingly, though, only 1 participant out of 40 steadfastly refused to administer shocks at the 300-volt level or above, at which point it was unmissably clear that the shocks were profoundly painful, agonizing for the subjects involved. A later study of the Milgram experiment and similar experiments that were carried out like the Milgram experiment that were carried out in future years found that across all of the experiments, summed up and averaged, the percentage of participants who are prepared to inflict, under orders, fatal voltages remained remarkably constant at roughly 2/3 of all participants. So here we actually have some numbers, some relatively disquieting numbers to put on the propensity of humans to be wicked. Now, Milgram's experiment is enormously contested, but in this way it seems very important that we pay attention to it. For what it shows is that ordinary people in modern industrial society, at least as much as ordinary as college undergraduates can be, and that's one of the challenges to Milgram, right? Whether or not the test subjects he was working with are actually a reliable body to generalize across the society. But given the range of subjects and the range of experiments that were carried on in the years following Milgram's pioneering experiments, to find again and again that roughly 2/3 of participants in all of these experiments are willing to obey the orders of the experimenter, the scientist, and cause unbearable, quite literally, unbearable pain, they think, to people who are suffering in a room a little bit away from them, is an astonishing, and I would say, extremely interesting and disquieting fact about human nature. Now, Milgram's study was famous for talking about obedience to authority, but there was another way of thinking about human wickedness, one that talked more about humans' tendencies to become willingly quite brutal. And another psychology professor, Philip Zimbardo of Stanford, who actually was a high school classmate of Milgram's, by the way, thought that he could explore this phenomenon as well. Zimbardo undertook what came to be known as the famous Stanford prison experiment. In 1971, Zimbardo ran this experiment and had findings interestingly consonant with Milgram's. He and his team picked 21 Stanford undergraduates, whom they deemed the most psychologically stable and healthy of the group that they had assembled. From more than 75 that they had initially assembled. And these people were put in distinct roles. They played distinct roles in a mock prison built in the basement of the Stanford Psychology Building. Some were called prisoners, others were called guards, and the selection process between these two groups was random. The guards were given weapons, they were given clothes, mirrored sunglasses, and wooden batons, not to be used in violent ways. The batons were not to be used to beat anybody, but merely to be worn to signify that they were guards. The prisoners were given ill-fitting smocks and stocking caps that rendered them constantly uncomfortable. They were called by assigned numbers sewn on their uniforms instead of by their names. A chain around their ankles reminded them that they were, in fact, the prisoners in this experiment. Again, entirely from the beginning, everybody knew this was a psychology experiment, a study, hypothetical. This wasn't meant to be a real thing. The participants chosen to play the part of prisoners were then arrested, quote unquote, at their homes and charged with armed robbery. The local Palo Alto Police Department helped by making the arrests and conducting full booking procedures on the prisoners, including fingerprinting them and taking mugshots. If any of you have done any experimentation in the social sciences in the past couple decades, you realize that this was truly another era. The degree to which the psychology experiment was run entirely on its own, irrespective of any standards of conduct or anything like that, is really amazing. And it's caused a great deal of criticism for Zimbardo, but nonetheless, I think the findings of his project still stand. At the police station, once they were there, once they had been photographed and fingerprinted, they were then transported to the mock prison, where they were strip searched and given their new identities. Things quickly got out of hand. The guards clearly, so to speak, quote unquote, lived into their roles more than was anticipated. And from the beginning, they enjoyed demonstrating their superior status to the prisoners. On day 2 of the experiment, the prisoners revolted, and the guards, acting entirely on their own, used fire extinguishers to scuttle the revolt. As the days grew on, the guards grew increasingly sadistic, humiliating the prisoners whenever possible. Roughly 1/3 of the guards showed clear sadistic tendencies, as psychologically defined. That is, they clearly and demonstrably enjoyed inflicting pain and getting pleasure from the infliction of pain itself, no matter that the pain infliction led to other benefits for them, such as increased power over the inmates, getting to do what they wanted, whatever. It was clear that these guards enjoyed the infliction of pain itself, not its benefits pragmatically for them. Now, for a second here, just think about that. Zimbardo chooses these people precisely because they are the most stable of the people he's assembled, the 75 people. And these are Stanford undergrads. These are pretty emotionally well put together people, right? Even in the early 70s, Stanford's still a pretty good school. These are some pretty well-disciplined, well-organized human beings. And a third of them, probably much to their own surprise after the experiment's over, discover that they actually enjoy inflicting pain. That's a thought to ponder. On the third day of the experiment, the prison was moved as the guards began to worry that a prisoner released on the second day because he was clearly undergoing psychological stress would come back to break up the quote-unquote prison. No longer, for those on the inside, both prisoners and guards, merely considered an experiment. The experiment got ever more brutal. Finally, on the sixth day, an external observer, a grad student, brought in to interview subjects, was so troubled by the conditions and the behavior that she witnessed that she demanded that the experiment be stopped. Now, Zimbardo and others have argued that the experiment suggests not a kind of quote-unquote Lord of the Flies mentality among humans, but rather instead how malleable human personality is, how readily we inhabit a role when we are provided with a kind of rationale for it and a suitable set of surrounding social structures that in our immediate surroundings that allow us to inhabit this role properly. Note how unimportant, this is really interesting, unimportant the ultimately fictional character of the experiment was to the participants. Every one of them knew from the beginning that this was entirely a psychology experiment, right? It was a camp. It was a study. It was something with a finite beginning and a finite ending. The crucial thing, though, it turned out for everybody, guards and prisoners alike, was that there were immediate props around the world that could sustain the illusion from moment to moment that this was a real situation. The guards, once they put on their uniforms, their sunglasses, and held their batons, began to really live into that role in astonishing ways. The prisoners, once they had been picked up by the police and transported to the prison, clearly felt like they were, in some sense, prisoners. Zimbardo and his team thought that this suggested, maybe evidenced quite conclusively for them, that people are inherently creatures of context. And the context doesn't have to be in place for all that long, doesn't even have to be all that enduring or stable or even ultimately plausible for us to have it be sufficiently powerful in order to organize our behavior by means of it. Even a make-believe context, right, as children will play, even a make-believe context turns out to have all the reality we need to become, for fully one-third of us, one-third of the most stable of us, to become sadists. Now, Zimbardo's experiment was controversial for a number of reasons, and Dr. Zimbardo himself has never been a slouch at self-promotion. But it's self-promotion, I think, for a very good cause. His studies, especially the prison experiment, show how easy it is for humans to slip into the grip of domination and sadism. What's equally troubling, though, is other studies that suggest how uneasy, how difficult people find it to be kind at times. How easy it is for people to be lured away from goodness, or even decency, by circumstances that seem trivial at best. And that is the perhaps depressing lesson of the so-called Good Samaritan studies, the third set of studies I want to look at in this lecture. So let's turn to those now. Now, John Darley and Daniel Batson were two psychologists at Princeton University, and they decided to run a study to figure out when people would help other people. They took as their subjects a group of seminary students, assuming that people who were in seminary, I mean, they hadn't been drafted into seminary, they wanted to go there, they felt some kind of vocation to care for other people, in some sense. Half the students were given the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? Asked to read it, and then told to go to another building across campus and give a sermon about that parable. The other half were asked to give a sermon about job opportunities in a seminary, right? So there are two sets of people given, one set given the parable of the Good Samaritan and told to give a sermon, another told to give another kind of sermon that maybe is a little more self-interested. some of each group, right, were told they had to hurry to give their sermon. Others in each group were not told that, right? So you actually had 4 different sets of people. The hurrying Good Samaritans, the not hurrying Good Samaritans, the hurrying business opportunities or job opportunities in the seminary, and the not hurrying job opportunities in the seminary. Now, on the way to the building where they would each give the sermon, subjects passed by a person slumped in an alleyway, possibly the victim of a violent attack, but in any event, someone who looked to be in need of real help. It was ensured that the people going on the way to give the sermon, it was ensured that they each were able to see and perceive and apprehend what was going on with this person, right? They couldn't just walk by unseeing. They saw what was going on. The question that the psychologist asked was, would these people stop to help the person? As you might guess, the depressing conclusion was that the people who had been studying the Good Samaritan, story of the Good Samaritan, did not stop any more often than the ones preparing for a speech on job opportunities. The factor that really seemed to make a difference was how much of a hurry the students were in. If they were in a hurry, only about 10% would stop to give aid, even when they were on their way to deliver a sermon about the Good Samaritan. That is, a story about how all the people should stop and give aid. The ironies of this experiment are manifold. Most profound is the fact that the study uses the biblical story perhaps most profoundly anathema to its findings as a core component of its experiment. It's almost as if these psychologists were guided by Satan or something. I mean, it's just such a perfect example of why exactly the Good Samaritan story needs to be still listened to by many Christians. For what does the Good Samaritan story tell you but that context should never matter? After all, in the story of the Good Samaritan, the point of the story is that the Samaritan, the person who does stop and help the person on the side of the road, Samaritans are considered outcasts in the Palestine of Jesus's, in the Judaism of Jesus's Palestinian world. People thought that Samaritans were unlikely to be moral in any situation, much less in a situation dealing with a victimized stranger, right? The closest stereotype in the modern world would be the way that gypsies were stereotyped 100 years ago, right? A Samaritan would be more likely to rob the beaten and bleeding victim again than to help him. That would be the expectation. So Jesus' parable tells you that what matters is not the outward appearance of the person, right? The priest and the Levite in the story pass the victim by, though they have all the outward trappings of those who should help. Instead, the story is supposed to say that it is the despised Samaritan who helps because he's good on the inside, as it were. Because the Samaritan is, in some sense, a person whose inner character is so strong as to make him stop. What the psychologists found out, though, is that hardly anybody actually operates under those structures. 10% of the people who would listen to the story of the Good Samaritan, but were in a hurry, stopped to help. The lesson we can draw from all of these stories, the scientists say, is a lesson contained in what they call the situational attribution theory. This theory says that people are much more determined by their surrounding context than their innate character. Situations cause behavior. Behavior, character, does not drive situations. That's the idea. This fact, for the psychologists, entails good news and bad news. Bad news first. The bad news is that character, as an innate moral quality we possess, is not so important as we might think. Perhaps it's not actually even real. Perhaps we are always just a step or two away from indifference, obedience for cruelty, or outright sadism. On the other hand, there is in some ways some good news about this story. In the right context, given the right circumstances, people can be better than we anticipate. People are possibly going to be able to find resources within themselves if they're in a context or if they have the time to let themselves be moral. This is a sign of some hope. Now, are either of these points really news? That is, someone might say to the psychologist, don't we already know these insights from the history we've been studying all along? Don't we know from Arendt, right, that people will obey mindlessly? Don't we know that many people will turn out to be sadists, even if we don't see them being sadists in ordinary life? Don't we know that most of us don't care? The point of the Good Samaritan story is that everyone should care, but the fact that the story is there suggests that Jesus thought it was important for people to know that many of them didn't care and that they should, right? In other words, whether or not the novelty of these experiments is as novel as they thought it was is an open question. But I still think, even if you don't think they're all that novel, I think they're pretty novel. I think they're pretty interesting. Even if you don't think that, they're still profoundly interesting and sobering studies. In different ways, they seem to suggest that, in fact, these are not just hypothetical situations where people might become wicked. We have some confirmable evidence outside of the actual reality of evil in history itself, but in somewhat more controlled experimental environments of what actually could happen to people. I would hope that in coming decades, psychologists, maybe especially in the positive psychology movement, may find ways to explore how people can learn to help each other or to resist such evils as well. But this set of very depressing experiments is at least a good start. Now next, we're going to return to our track of asking about the way that thinkers have dealt, not so scientifically, but more in terms of journalism and thinking, philosophy and religion, with the history of evil since the Shoah, in the litany of genocides and atrocities that we've seen happen in the world since 1945.